everyone. Thank you so much for attending our inaugural first ever event from our Transformative Play Initiative event series at Uppsala University at the Department of Game Design. We are thrilled to have Whitney Strix Beltrán with us today. I have known Whitney, I think, since 2012. We met at WeirdCon, which is a California convention. And she told me, I think I might want to write on myth and LARP. And I was like, please do that. And I've been, a huge admirer of her work ever since. She is a scholar. She is a game designer. She does both analog and video games. And we are so, so blessed to have her. So I will read you her bio. Whitney Strix Beltrán is a multiple award-winning narrative designer for video games and TTRPGs. She is the project narrative director at Hidden Path Entertainment and on an unannounced AAA Dungeons and Dragons title. She holds a master's degree in Mythology and Depth Psychology from Pacifica Graduate Institute in Santa Barbara. And my name is Sarah Lynn Bowman. I am a researcher at Uppsala University. And with that, I will hand it over to Whitney.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Sarah. I can't believe we've known each other for almost 10 years. That's crazy. So good morning to folks on the West Coast of the US. Good evening to folks over in Europe and everywhere in between. I'm so excited to have you. Today, we're going to be talking more in a doing sense, in like actually creating things, than perhaps an academic sense. My goal is that you are able to leave today and go to your own game design or the way that you think about stories and apply it. I'm really big into application, so hopefully that is what we get out of today. So today I am presenting Everything is the Self, designing character ensembles for player catharsis. And Sarah already did a wonderful job introducing me, so I don't have to do that again. But this slideshow is in case, I guess, anyone needs it afterwards, so they remember who I am. I will point out, though, that I am on social media, and I do love to talk about these subjects with anybody who is respectful. So follow me on Twitter. I'm _Strix. I have my own website, as you can see. So let us get into the meat of today. So in order to understand how to design for player catharsis using an ensemble cast, we actually have to start with a basic understanding of like what the self is. Who is the self? What is the self? Why is it capitalized? For today's presentation and how we're going to work the subject, I'm going to take a depth psychological approach, which is really a Jungian, Carl Jung, understanding of psychology and soul, and use it as some basic tools to build into an actual design practice. Just a note on Carl Jung and depth psychology. He was popular in the 50s, and the discipline of psychology as a medical practice has definitely changed since then. And there were things that were not great about Jung or Jungian psychology, particularly in regards to the anima-animus split, which is a gender thing, which we'll talk about a little bit later. But I just want us all to go in with eyes wide open. That this is a flawed typology, just like all typologies, and you should never take anything as gospel, including what he says and including what I say. So let me just preface with that. So self. The self in a Jungian sense is kind of a tapestry of all the different parts of us that we both see and perceive, and don't see and don't perceive. So a lot of people who haven't thought about this subject too heavily think their selves is this part, the face, the way they express themselves to other people in the world, and what they have going on up front. In a Jungian understanding, that's actually called the persona or the ego. And that's just the part that's at the front of like the whole self that is hiding out behind the mask that we all wear. And so the self, capital S, is not the ego. It's not this person that's talking to you right now. It is this person that's talking to you right now and everything else that goes into it. So I have a little diagram that I'll show you in just a minute that looks really complicated, but it's really not. We'll spend some time on it. But basically, we can think about the self as an amalgamation of our consciousness. So what we think and perceive and do, and we know, the part of ourselves that we know, and then the unconscious self. So all the psychology and the processing that sits in the layer underneath where we think consciously. And at the very, very depths of that is something called the collective unconscious, which is this really fascinating Jungian concept of how we kind of share this like archetypal soup that we all come from. So basically, there's a structure to the self. Jungian psychology gives a typology to this structure that is pretty nominally useful for the work we're going to do today. And so that is the frame that we use. As part of the self, there's a whole bunch of structure that involves archetypes. So archetypes are, what are archetypes? Archetypes are like little zip files. They're packets of information that are crammed really, really tight about what a basic personality is. And we see archetypes in our gods. We see them in Marvel characters. We see them everywhere because they're like a shorthand for describing who or what a person is, what their values are, kind of like the fundamentals of their being. Complexes are basically pieces of damage, like psychological damage that we experience in our lives. You know, when we're born and the first breath we take and we scream because everything's really frightening, like that's the beginning of a complex. Complexes, while they might sound scary, are not bad. They give color and texture and to our lives. But they definitely drive us in ways that sometimes we can't perceive. I'm going to explain that a little more as we get to our diagrams, we can visualize, because just words I know is hard to hang on to. And then we kind of tie this tapestry of self together with personal mythologies, meaning stories we tell ourselves about ourselves in order to understand who we are. That's what a personal mythology is. And personal mythologies, they can reflect, you know, larger mythologies, cultural mythologies. But, you know, we humans are very narrative beings. We understand ourselves and our world by telling stories about it. That's how we figure it out. We narrativize our whole lives. And so understanding that about ourselves means that we understand that we have a really powerful tool to work with when it comes to storytelling. So where do all these pieces of the self come from? Like, am I just making all this up? Is this some cloud in the sky? Well, no, there's some ways to think about the pieces of who we are. So we can start with the inherent self, which is a really like not clean way to describe like the inborn personality traits that you're just born with. Like, why are some children they're born and you just know that they're stubborn, or you know that they're really sensitive, or they're really thoughtful? There's just something you're born with. We don't know why, we don't know how, it's just you. And most parents know this about their kids, right? There are some things that you're not changing. But the self is also socially derived. Humans are very social creatures. We are meant to live in societies, and we are built around understanding ourselves through the prisms of other people and kind of course correcting and aligning ourselves with other people as well. So socialization is a really powerful force in forming and growing the self. Other people are integral to the self. You can't be alone. It's not possible. Other people shape and influence who you are. Then there's the ecologically derived self, which is the way to say that like our natural environment, if you live in a desert, if you live near a forest, if you live in an urban area, that also really helps define yourself, again, capital S. We kind of forget that the environment is a part of us here in the West, but it's actually a really important component of metabolizing and processing like who we are. The ecological environment outside is reflected by the ecological environment inside, and vice versa. So don't forget nature. And then there's that wiggly little idea, the collective unconscious. So the collective unconscious is kind of like, it's just like the psychic primordial ooze that we all come from and is at the base of all of us and that we share with the rest of humanity. Carl Jung himself kind of wrestled with what the collective unconscious was for his whole career, and came to actually differing conclusions over time. But let's just say for our own selves, the collective unconscious is like the core thing, kind of like unites us all at the very bottom of our brain stems, at our lizard brains, to be of a people. And then finally, there's the self we make. We have a conscious hand in how we go forward and who we are and how we process things. And we should not forget our own power to drive change and to drive the shape of ourselves. It is one good thing the ego and the persona, the conscious self, is good for, is choosing which direction to drive ourselves, if we are aware enough and if we understand kind of the components of what's going on, which hopefully today we'll get more purview into that. Okay, so here's a really weird, scary image that maybe looks like, someone doing seances in the 20s might make. but let's talk about what is here and what this is. So this is a very basic diagram of a Jungian understanding of the self, the big self. And at the very top, we can orient towards the outer world, right? Outside us, socialization, people. And at the very bottom is an inner world, which is kind of where that collective unconscious dwells. It goes inside deep. And so this is basically a diagram of kind of like what our psyches look like in a depth psychology point of view, which will hopefully be helpful to us as we get deeper into the discussion today. So outer world is literally outside, what's outside your body. As I mentioned, the persona is the face, the conscious self that we present to other people is our persona. That's me right now, talking is the persona. And then there's the ego. And the ego is kind of like the unit of yourself that like looks out for you, the individual. And it kind of like controls your ego boundary, meaning like your delineation between conscious self and unconscious self, so that parts of the unconscious self that we don't want to deal with or that are scary, like don't bubble up into the persona and infect it, basically. So the ego is kind of like the controller, making sure everything like stays in its place. Then you see kind of this level called the personal unconscious. So that's the part of ourselves that we don't think about. Maybe I am really afraid of deep water. I'm afraid of the ocean, thalassophobia, but I don't really want to think about it because it scares me. So I push it down into my unconsciousness and I don't really think about it. I'm like, la, 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 it's fine. But every time I drive by a lake, I feel nervous and I don't know why. That would be because it's in the unconscious and I can't perceive that it's affecting me, but it definitely is. So it's kind of like where we put the things that we don't want to surface to the persona for a variety of reasons. So you see all those little C's in the personal unconscious, that stands for complex, which we just briefly touched on earlier. So complex is kind of like we're worked up over something, like something happened to us and we're not over it. So, maybe our parents didn't praise us enough as kids, or we were in a fire and lost everything, or, like any number of things, like just living life, right? You go through these experiences, but our minds kind of like build scar tissue up around it, or build like a little crinkle up around it, and we get kind of like fixated in a way. So that's what a complex is. So an example complex, one I just named, let's just say that your parents drove you to be really achievement oriented as a kid, and it was really important that you always succeeded, but they didn't like praise you for succeeding. They were like, well, I guess that's good enough. Try more later. And they didn't allow you to have space to fail. So now as an adult, you have a complex about failure, right? And you're really, really, really afraid of failure. So you do everything you can to avoid it. So that's a complex. Complexes are attached to archetypes, which you see go down a level into that collective unconscious we've been talking about. And we all share like a word cloud of archetypes, basically. They're all in the soup. And Jungian psychology supposes that complexes attach to archetypes themselves. So we as people kind of have like this rainbow of archetypes inside us that kind of like represent the human experience. So the classics are like, the Hierophant or the wizard, the mother, the anima animus, which is like the other gender of ourselves, the inverse gender, is again problematic. And all the little pieces of ourselves that we can like identify as component parts. And some of them are stronger than others. Some of them are more developed than others. Sometimes your persona, like your self, it's like, oh yeah, I'm really like the thief. I'm sneaky. I'm really like the wizard. I'm really smart and like to study. That's identifying with one of your archetypes. It's totally fine. That's okay. But we are always more than one archetype on the inside. There's a bunch of them. And we can nurture them and we can atrophy them. And we can bring them kind of closer to the surface by working with them, or push them down deeper into the collective unconscious where we don't want to deal with them. And that's where the shadow comes in. So the shadow is maybe something you've heard about if you've worked with depth psychology at all in the past, but if not, totally fine. So the shadow is the parts of ourselves that we just want to hide. We do not, it goes in the bag, it gets pushed away, and we don't deal with it for years. And that doesn't always mean like something bad you did or something negative that happened to you. It's just something you actually don't want to deal with. So it can be positive things too. It's more rare. And so the shadow, like once you stick something in the bag, it doesn't go away. It's still in the bag, like it's still there waiting for you. And part of individuation, which is a process of like getting to know yourself better and integrate who you are into like a more whole person, which we'll talk about later, is like taking stuff in the bag of shadow, like back out and dealing with it after it's like been musking around in the dark for years and maybe getting stronger or weirder. And that is also in the unconscious mind. Now, I don't really want to talk about soul image or man and personality. Those are not really relevant to what we're talking about. And this diagram is by a person who I don't totally agree with, again, on how Jungian psychology should be represented. So hopefully that's not too confusing, but it gives us a visual basis of this construct that I'm making for us, because we're going to use it to delve into making an ensemble cast for player catharsis. Okay, so we've established the self. We know the component parts, basically, kind of know what goes into it. So how does the self grow? Like, how do we proceed as humans into the future and become more complex and rich and maybe happy. That would be good. First of all, our archetypes, right? The pieces of ourselves that are kind of like those basic component parts, the wizard, the hierophant, the lovers, the ingenue. They don't just like exist in little bubbles inside your mind. They have relationships with each other. They talk to each other. That's a really important component to think about and to remember for us today, because our pieces of ourselves do not exist in a vacuum. They talk sometimes where the persona, right, the front part, the conscious part, can't hear down in the unconscious mind. And so, one of our goals is to get down there and hear what they're talking about. And we want to do that because it helps us understand ourselves better, right? It moves us towards a catharsis. So that's really important to kind of like fix in your mind. We also grow ourselves through processing, meaning taking time to like think about and put together and reify our experiences and our self-understanding. So processing is something you can do in therapy. Therapists are really good at helping you with that. It's something you can do on your own. There are techniques to processing. There are many internet articles about this, but it is something that some people do without thinking about. And it's some people never do unless they think about it and know that it's a thing. So we'll kind of like put processing like up front and center as we think about these things. And then, as I mentioned, the big one is tackling the shadow, or maybe like gently inviting the shadow back into your life, depending on what you want to do. So we call this generally shadow work in my realm of understanding. And shadow work is tough sometimes. Like catharsis is earned, right? It's not always like a rainbow pleasant experience with clouds and happy faces. Like sometimes you really got to dig in and you got to feel what's happening and bleed a little, and then you arrive at a place where you feel more whole. So anytime I bring up shadow work, I just feel personal responsibility to let people know like it's serious business. Like, don't just be like, I'm going to go mess with my shadow because I heard Whitney talk about it and it sounds interesting. You can dysregulate yourself and you can get into sort of like, psychological trouble if you don't treat that process with respect. So just, I'm letting you know, this is my caution. And then of course, there's the biggest word of the day, which is individuation. So individuation is like the culmination of all of the stuff we've talked about, like getting set up with understanding the construction of your psyche, engaging with your archetypes, surfacing your unconscious thoughts, dealing with the shadow, and then integrating it all together to better self-understanding. That is individuation, right? Becoming an integrated individual self, capital S. And what individuation means is like really like coming to peace with yourself. It doesn't mean fixing your shadow. It doesn't mean like absolving all your complexes so you have no complexes anymore. I don't even think that's possible. But it does mean like finding grace and finding peace and learning to like be okay with who you are and love yourself more and be whole. I think probably all of us are looking for a little bit of more wholeness in our lives. I know I am. And that brings us to this question of, well, what about young people? Because these are games we're going to be talking about, and young people play games. Can young people individuate? This is a tricky question, right? Because young people are still forming their personalities. They're still like discovering new complexes to add to their psyches. And in general, on principle, young people can't really work with shadow because it's not time. Like there's not enough in there. They're really too young to deal with it, and they're changing so much that you kind of got to like slow down, kind of have to have like, the log of experiences in your book before you can really come around to working with the shadow specifically But individuation, might be weaker for someone who has not lived a whole lot. And that's not saying that they don't have depth of experience or self-understanding. It just means like there's more road to go. So the efficacy of catharsis and individuation for young people is a little dicey. Young people. So Ali asked, what do I mean by young people? I mean, mostly teenagers in really early 20s. Probably up to like 25, maybe. I mean, it really depends. Like, we're Westerners and we have pretty cushy lives. So you probably have to be a little bit older to really get somewhere. But like, if you grew up, in the streets of Bangalore, in the slums, probably 18, you've got a lot to work on. So it's really hard to give like a specific number. It's more like how much you've got in you from the experiences that you have. So I don't know, hopefully that's helpful, Allie. Okay, so the part we all really want to get to now that we've set up our runway of understanding here is role-playing games and how they are a wonderful vehicle of transformation in regards to thinking about catharsis and shadow work and individuation. I have written about this in the past. If you go to academia.edu and look me up, there are papers, which Sarah helped facilitate publishing, about shadow work and LARP and role-playing and ego bleed and a whole bunch of things that are really relevant to the subject. If you feel like you need a little bit more of like a basic understanding of what we're talking about today, or to think down different lines and branches of this work. So what makes role-playing games special and particularly good tool for this? Role-playing games are basically constructed to engage with simulated selves. Right? So we're playing a character in a game and maybe he's a vampire hunter, or maybe she's a high priestess, or, maybe they are like a rogue in disguise, that we are making selves. We are setting up a pastiche self. And why this is actually good is because this creates alibi. Meaning like your brain says this pastiche self that I'm making, right? This imaginary self isn't really me. So I don't have to worry about all the things I normally worry about when I'm projecting my own self. So basically it disarms the ego, right? That part that patrols to make sure we stay put together, because the ego's like, well, that's not really me. So I don't really have to enforce the rules. And this is very good. This is very good for us. Because what that means is, parts of the self that are usually like really, really pushed down in the unconscious, like can loosen up and maybe float to the surface or be exposed or intentionally interrogated if you are thinking about role-playing and approaching it in that way. So RPGs are like just chef kiss perfect for starting to engage with self and getting the ego out of the way so we can really play with what's going on in our psyches. Role-playing games are often derived from archetypal structures and rules. So if you think about Dungeons and Dragons, if you think about the character classes, rogue, warlock, fighter, monk, they're all archetypes. Like they're just dyed in the wool archetypes. We're starting from a place of archetypal structure. And that is very common across almost all, that's why I say often, almost all role-playing games. Sometimes it's not the case, but it's kind of a rare edge case. And so we are when we're working directly with an archetype, that means we get to pull the strings on the archetypes in our unconscious mind. We get to kind of push them up to the surface and work with them. And if we do this in a very directed way, then we can get a lot out of it, right? And though a lot of people still get a lot out of it, even if they're never consciously aware of the fact that that's what they're doing, or they're not intending a specific kind of work, when they decide to play an archetypal persona in the role-playing game. And this is really great because, as I mentioned, archetypes are filled with really dense information, kind of packed in there like a zip file. And when you engage with playing as an archetype in a role-playing game, you spend time with it. You open that archetype up, you explore what's inside of it, and you learn more nuance. You learn more story about what that archetype is and means, and then you relate it back to yourself, which is really positive. And then the other thing to consider is RPGs are really social in nature. Like you can't really play a role-playing game and be like alone there, because at the very least the narrative is with you, like the story that you're telling is present with you, but like 90% of the time there are other characters involved, whether they're played by people or whether they're NPCs, so non-player characters. You're creating that social structure through which your personality and your identity is filtered, right? It's pinging around other people. There are some single player role-playing games where like you're just playing a vampire, like reflecting on their immortal lives in a journal. That happens, but for most of the time, you are simulating social engagement, again, with an archetype. This is really important. Okay, so we talked about role-playing games as a vehicle, and now we're going to talk about how to drive the car, the actual like design principles that we can apply today. So again, I want to remind you that we want to start with a depth psychological understanding of archetypes in the self, so all that stuff that we just experienced. But really, like, don't let it limit you. Like, if you're really interested in this and you go and you want to look up Jungian psychology and you want to work with those structures, again, like, it's more like guidelines, right? It's more like the Pirates Code, where you're going to take what you want from it and leave the things that don't work. That's really important for a body of work that's this old, and has kind of stayed unevolved. Well, that's not fair. There's the Zurich Institute that still works pretty heavily with depth psychology, but realize that like it is no longer parallel with modern clinical psychology. We'll put it that way. So to touch on the 4 major Jungian archetypes, because again, we're going to be working really heavily with archetypes. There's the self, which we've been talking about a lot. The persona, which again is our face. The shadow, which is the bag that we put all the things we don't want to deal with into. And the anima animus. And I've been kind of sliding past the anima animus, but I'll take this moment to talk about it a little bit more in depth and what it really is. So the anima or the animus is like a foil to ourselves, and it's meant to be gendered. And I personally don't know if that is really relevant any longer for a lot of people. So I want to build space for saying like, let's think about the anima animus in a different way. But basically, every person has like masculinity and femininity inside of them to some degree or another. And if you are dominant in one angle, if you're masculinely dominant or femininely dominant, the other part of you that is masculine or feminine still exists inside of you, right? It's just kind of smaller. And so we give it a name and we give it an archetype so that we don't miss the fact that like as the human experience, like we really experience like all gender as individuals, just to different degrees and different ways. So manipulate that, use it if it's useful. I have worked with animuses before in my own work in Bluebeard's Bride, which is a horror RPG that I made heavily based off of archetypes and complexes. There is like an actual animus character and it works out really well. So just know that it's complicated and think about it before you really apply it to your work. Okay, so you've been hearing me like throw out names of archetypes, and you're maybe thinking like, where do these come from? Is there like an official list? There isn't. There are some pretty defined Jungian archetypes that most Jungians work with when thinking about archetypal work and individuation. And this is just kind of a simple map of that that we're looking at right now. So I'm just going to go through some of these because these are like really common staple archetypes. And that doesn't mean we have to work with them, but these are good ones to know. So the innocent is the archetype of ourselves that is the child, usually, that is like unharmed by complexes, or maybe is denying that they've been harmed by complexes, and is a fresh kind of naive perspective on the world, which we all still have within us, no matter how old we are or what we've been through. Like the innocent is still there. Maybe the innocent is small or hiding in adults, but they're around. The magician is also a really powerful archetype. The transmuter, the alchemist, kind of the wise person that we all have within ourselves. The caregiver, which, even if you have the maternal instincts of wood chipper, there's some part of you that is caregivery somewhere inside of your psyche. So this is, again, a useful structure. It's kind of a pat Jungian structure, but there are so many other archetypes that you can work with when thinking about building an ensemble cast, that I do not ever want you to feel like you're limited to one of these like Jungian structures. Like go and find weird archetypes, pull up lists from the internet, like think about other medias, Lord of the Rings, Marvel Cinematic Universe, like anything with gods or superheroes is a really easy place to steal from. And you definitely want to like get out of this kind of like set list, because there's more to life in the human experience, and we want to capture that. Okay, 20 minutes, we're doing good. So let's talk about the ensemble and why we build ensembles for this practice. So as I've mentioned, we are social creatures. Part of how we identify ourselves is through human interaction. And when we're playing role-playing games, again, we're usually representing a pretty concentrated archetype with our character, and everybody else is too. Or like in a single-player RPG video game, like all of your party or the people around you are pretty archetypal as well. So that means we're raising archetypes to the surface towards consciousness, and we get to have them out in the open and work with them and learn a whole bunch of stuff from them. So when we are building an ensemble for player catharsis, we're basically setting up like this rainbow of experiences around the character, sort of like filter themselves through to refract back at them. And so with these concentrated archetypes, you can get really specific about what you reflect back. So when we are actually doing this, we want to root ensemble characters in specific but wide archetypes, meaning we don't want really like obscure, tiny archetypes. We usually want to go with well-known, well-worn archetypes that we can get a lot out of. So lovers is a great one, the fool or the joker, the trickster. I love trickster archetypes, by the way. They're great. The mother. And the reason why you do this with the mother, for example, so the mother archetype isn't just like one thing. It's a wide archetype, as I mentioned, which means there's a lot inside of it. So what kind of mother archetype are you surfacing? Are you servicing the martyr mother who, is always battered by what she sacrifices for children and is unappreciated? Are you servicing the bear mother, the really overprotective, defensive, strong woman who protects her offspring's lives? Are you servicing like the poisonous mother, right? The one that seeds you with doubt and ruins your self-confidence, so that you cling to her as the only source of power and surrogacy. So that's what I mean by wide archetype, is you pick one and then you think about like what inside that archetype you really want to work with. So again, wide variety of characters, give an archetype to each. And how do you decide what archetypes to give your ensemble? This part's actually really important. So ensemble characters should be dynamically complementary to each other. What I mean by that is they should work together. They should be greater than the sum of their parts. So as a unit, as a family, this ensemble should be a strong, interconnected identity, right? Because everything is the self, that can reflect your identity back at you. And so we want to think about foils and inversions. So are characters in the ensemble foils to each other? Are they inversions of each other? Because again, in like real life psychology, like archetypes have relationships with each other. Do you remember me saying that? So we want to do the same thing here, not just have them have relationship to the player. Absolutely, yes, but also rich relationships with each other. We want to create lovers and friends, and we want to match strengths with weaknesses. So if someone is physically strong and emotionally really delicate and vulnerable, we want someone that's physically weak but emotionally really, really strong. We want to put them together, right? We want to start matching pieces into a cohesive whole. And most importantly, as the player, you have to love the ensemble. Like you have to find things about them that are really interesting, that are really moving. You have to get really involved and emotionally invested with them. And what that usually means is they have to feel like real people. They have to feel alive. So you really want to spend time giving depth and personality and strong archetypal feeling to your ensemble, because you have to sell them to the player. That's really important. Because otherwise they just won't care what happens with the ensemble, which means it'll be less effective in getting catharsis for them. So we have to make them endearing and lovable, and we want to be around them. Even the evil ones, like we can make really interesting evil characters that we want to be around. So that's important to think about. The ensemble itself, as I mentioned, creates a family unit. So imagine the diagram we had earlier was talking about all the archetypes making up the unconscious self. We are basically duplicating that on the outside, in the outer world, through creating this family unit of the ensemble, kind of like represents like the outer representation of those archetypes, like outside your own mind and outside your own body. We've taken that thing that's inside and pulled it outside with this ensemble. If you are looking for more ways to understand this or to do more research on this, I would direct you towards internal family systems, which is not Jungian actually, but is a therapy technique in talk therapy, where you discuss like how the different parts of yourself do jobs in your psyche. So this is also a really useful reference point that I just want to point out, is internal family systems. And there's a decent amount of information about that online. Damage. This is maybe my favorite part. So in order to make your ensemble characters sticky, they need complexes. They need the damage to make them gripping and interesting, and also to have them move through individuation themselves. So again, what a complex looks like is just something that someone's kind of churned up about on an unconscious level, right? They have a God complex. They think they should just rule everything. Or they have a complex, about being raised poor, or like any number of things that you can think of. It's the thing that it's like this silent motivator that pushes them to interact with the world in a certain way. So interact with the world through the lens of their complex or complexes. Now, real life human beings are like, a bag of complexes. We've got a lot of them. But in general, when I'm designing an ensemble, I want to give a single ensemble character like one defining complex, like a big one, not a small one, so that it really drives their actions. And I, as the designer, understand what they're going to do because I know what their complex is. So you give them a complex it's whatever is making them sad. They have PTSD from a war, they were unloved, whatever it is. And then you give them a drive. So drive is like what they're seeking in the world, what they're aiming for, kind of like where the engine is pushing them, even if they're unconscious of that happening. So the drive is derived from the complex itself. So it has to be related. So if, an NPC wants world peace, they better want world peace because it's related to their complex where, they were in a war and they've never been safe. And so world peace will ensure their safety. There is a relationship, a one-to-one between complex and drive. The really interesting thing here between drive and complex is I personally think that there are a spectrum between adaptive drives and unadaptive drives in relation to complex. So an adaptive drive would be like, I'm going to take this complex, I'm going to have a drive related to it that's positive. So again, I want world peace. I'm going to work towards world peace to help solve my complex of being afraid of never being safe. Seems pretty adaptive as long as it's like, done in a healthy way. But let's say you want to feel safe. So you want to control the world. You want to be like, a supervillain, right? That will ensure that my complex is addressed and I will always be safe if I control everything with a laser that can explode the moon. That is also a drive related to the complex, and it's a little maladaptive. And that's how we get villainy a lot of times, which I think is really interesting. How we have complexes and how we relate to them and how we address them with our drives kind of like shows like where we are on the spectrum of good and evil sometimes. That's really fun to think about when you're designing these characters. And then the third thing is you need to give every one of your ensemble cast a shine, meaning a good thing about them that we hold dear and love. And that includes the villains. Shine in villains is actually really awesome. So a shine is the part of them that we respect, that we cherish, that we find very interesting or fun. It's the flavor that really makes them like endearing in our minds. And again, you do this for everybody, not just the good guys, not just the friends in the ensemble, but the enemies and the villains too. I think it's actually especially important for them to really make them stick as people. So you have complex, you have drive, and you have shine on top of, again, your base archetype. And that kind of constructs the self or the psyche of each individual ensemble character. And again, with the idea that they interrelate, that they have relationships with each other, that they're foils and complementary and enemies with each other, lovers and friends. So that is a lot to put into a very active family, but that's what makes it feel real and alive and arms it for player catharsis, which is the part we're going to talk about actively engaging with next. So this is the engine of the car, right, that we are driving towards player catharsis. Okay, engineering cathartic moments. So all of this work and knowledge up to this point has brought us here. So this is really the execution point of everything we've talked about so far. So creating cathartic moments for the player means that often the ensemble is having cathartic moments for themselves, or they're individuating themselves. So you want to create narrative opportunities for ensemble characters to hit upon their own shadow work, processing, and individuation. This is an extra layer of alibi, right? We are in a game, so it's not real, it doesn't matter, and I'm watching other people do it, so it's extra safe. We still get to absorb and observe and get understanding from those moments, which is really important. And so basically kind of like putting inner work outside where we can see it and articulate it and observe it in a way that doesn't threaten us, right? Ego's not involved. The shadow's not trying to take over and eat us. So it puts it in a place where it's all very manageable and processable. And when we have cathartic moments with our ensemble casts, we want to make it big. Like we want it to be like a moment. So we want dramatism. We want huge heel turns. We want to show very specifically, this is what's happening now. They were this way before, and they're facing the dark night of the soul, or they're in that moment where they have to make a decision to like save someone else or themselves, or like stab someone or let themselves be stabbed, like the high drama, and then let it happen. And then the important part is you got to sit with those characters afterwards. Okay, you have to sit with the aftermath of that catharsis for the ensemble characters or the individuation point, and you need to see how they have changed or not changed in their persona afterwards. So that means high intimacy with the ensemble cast is necessary. Alice asked another question. When I say ensemble, do I mean NPCs in an RPG context? Yes, I mostly mean NPCs. However, you can do it with player characters as well. I'll reference my game Bluebeard's Bride one more time here, where I specifically engineered player character sheets to do these things as well. It's a little more complicated and it's much more limited in scope when you have to do this with live players, which is why I prefer ensembles that are NPCs, but it can be done. Mostly I mean NPCs though. We've talked about sitting with characters after their individuation point or their cathartic moment, and we do want to make it a moment because we want it to be dramatic and visible. And then we need to do the opposite as well. We need to create narrative opportunities for ensemble characters to fail at individuation, which means they make a bid for a change, for discovering themselves, for becoming integrated or more whole, and they either reject it, which is horrible and amazing, or something else really dramatic and awful happens, like maybe they die. You do want to be careful with character death when you are engaging in this specific practice of like aiming for player catharsis, right, through ensemble cast, because when you kill an archetype of the self, you're killing a piece of the self. Every lesson is absorbed when someone is playing a role-playing game. And so I'm not saying don't kill your ensemble cast, because I'm pretty notorious for doing that and it works out really well. But you do want to be conscientious of kind of what parts of the family unit you're hacking away if you make that dramatic of a choice, because it will have repercussions on like how the whole family unit is doing, and also like, are you cutting away a piece that the player like really feels? And again, you can do that specifically and on purpose, and it can have great results. But you do really have to, I think, have mastery at that point and really have confidence in what you're doing and delivering a really specific experience. I'm sorry, I'm just looking at the chat. So we are talking about player catharsis specifically. Answering the question in chat, asking if we are trying to make players engage with NPC catharsis, or if we want players to have it. We want players to have it. So the last thing is probably the most important part here, and that is reflecting the player's actions and decisions through the prism of the ensemble cast. And this is actually the big one. Like the first two are good to haves, and this last point is the have to have out of this conversation. And that is when a player makes a choice, again, as their archetypal selves, they're trying out, that echoes out into the world. You want the ensemble cast to react in a way that is in line with their own archetypes and complexes. And what this does, this is kind of the whole crux of this, is when you do a thing, when you make a decision, when you have an action, and you send it out, and it reflects and bounce off of an engineered ensemble cast for this purpose, what you're getting is, again, the breadth of the human experience reflecting back at you. So let's say that you and your, just say it's Dungeons and Dragons video game. Not my Dungeons and Dragons video game, because that's under NDA. But you are in a tavern with your party in this game, and some bar patron picks on you, and you pick a fight, and you like punch him in the face, and you really hurt him. And maybe the warrior in your party is like, yeah, that's good, it's that warrior archetype. And maybe the caretaker in your party is like, do we really need to do that? Hurting them hurts us, right? And maybe the innocent in your party is like, why did you do that? I don't understand why that violence is necessary. And so again, this just really exposes and makes digestible our own archetypal understandings of ourselves, which is really powerful. So when we work towards player catharsis, it is through the vehicle of these ensemble characters. And when one of them reacts to us, right, in game in a way that shows the archetypal underpinnings of why they react that way, we learn something about this and we feel something about this, and it helps us with our own integration. Okay, last slide. Perfect timing. So let them sit with it is my final takeaway for you. So when a player experiences catharsis through their understanding or reactions from a party member's ensemble cast, you want to give them time to absorb it. You want to give them time to sit with it, and that means you do need to like design for that. Like if you're gonna deliberately lead a player towards a cathartic moment or integration or individuation, you should also design for reflections. Like you should purposely trigger reflection on those moments. Like, what did that mean? How do I feel now? Are there consequences? Is the world different? And because it's an RPG world, it can be different, right? It can reflect the self also. Everything is the self. That's what's wonderful about games. And you can show the state change, which really helps players absorb that. And then finally, you want to, if you can, ritualize outcomes, meaning kind of like put them to bed. Ritualization is a really powerful tool in psychology. I think most of us know that. And when we're, especially in social situations with other people, players, characters, when you ritualize something, so you say, this is the set actions that we go through every time we have this experience, it helps it stick in the brain. Yeah, that's it for now. We're going to switch to questions and answers, and I see we have some awesome questions that we can get to. We have a half hour for this, so we can really dig into your specific questions. I know there's probably a lot of them. So I'm going to take a moment to look at chat and to just kind of size up what we have going on. So thank you for sticking with me this far, and just give me a moment to see what's up.
Thank you so much for that deep dive into theory and into some of the mechanics, really, of the consciousness and the unconsciousness. It was very rich to hear. I think the first comment is from Hampus, and we have several other people. I just wanted to note that we are recording in case anybody is uncomfortable.
Okay.
It's also on video.
So I'll read this first question out loud, and then I will try to respond to it in the best of my ability. So I'm intrigued by your system for RPG ensemble play, and much of it is transferable to LARPing. Yes, this is true. But there is much more a practice of co-creating, and the player can steer her narrative much more. Would it help or hinder transformation, do you think? I'm guessing for skilled players, it's easier, but much more difficult for the designers to help all players in these processes. I actually agree with you a lot. I don't have much to add there. I think you're already on it. In my personal life, my most powerful experiences of player catharsis, riffing off the ensemble cast around me, the other players, was in LARP. And I can think of a specific time actually where it was like one of the best things ever. And that was because I had a degree in mythology and depth psychology, and I knew what I was doing, right? I was really adept and ready to deal with this. For players that are just starting out LARPing, or really uncomfortable with switching selves, or don't really understand alibi, or you're just scared of being vulnerable, which is really normal and natural, it's much harder to do, which is why, if it's something you're seeking, I think designing for it in specific is a great way to try to tackle it. When you get to steer your narratives, it's not like you're locked to an archetypal journey path. Like, I don't really ascribe to the hero's journey. I actually hate it quite a lot. Sorry, Joseph Campbell. But like, the archetype is more like, how do I say this? It sets up like the strictures for how you travel. It is not your path. So I don't feel like they're too limiting in either a LARP or a tabletop or a video game understanding, right? Because we're kind of talking like this pastiche of like 3 different correlated activities. But yeah, they're not super limiting. Okay, the next one I'm looking to says, you've alluded to catharsis often in the talk. Can you say something about the pros and cons of designing for allow players to experience catharsis through their characters? This is a great question. Catharsis is not without risk. I think, as I said earlier, like I meant it, dealing with the shadow is risky, sometimes not fun, sometimes overwhelming. Sometimes you're not ready for catharsis, and if you try to force it, it's really ugly. Some people don't want to play with catharsis, and that is totally okay. And if you design a game for that, you should probably make it really clear on the label what's going on. People can attempt catharsis and not reach it. Like they go for it and maybe they don't arrive there in that game, and they feel sad, or they're like, what's wrong with me that I didn't grow? All the normal things around, the delicacies of our minds, I think, is present here as it would be in talk therapy or anywhere else. Catharsis requires some amount of maturity, which is why I brought up earlier, the deal with young people as we understand them, and their relationship to catharsis, and whether that's really stable ground or not. Like, I'm not the expert, I'm not a licensed catharsis manager for people, but it is something to take into consideration. Okay, next question. I've been taking in the talk from the lens of a computer game where the game provides the ensemble characters. Is that your main intent? I guess it's who provides the ensemble characters. Cool. This is a great question. There are really a couple ways to look at it. One is you are the designer in the game who is designing a game for other people to play, and it is a video game, and you want to carefully craft an ensemble to push players towards feelings of understanding themselves better, towards catharsis. It's absolutely one model to use this. I think, as Ali mentioned, it can be deployed in LARP. And this requires co-creation, which means more people need to be on board, or at least aware of kind of what you're aiming for. Also, in fairness to them, like, they should just understand, the nature of the game that they're playing. And in tabletop, again, because tabletop is super archetypal and is already set up for this, it's applicable too. So the core ideas of like the psyche structure, like archetypes, complexes, shine, how we reflect our actions to other people, I think can be taken to all three formats. I think the design process is just slightly different for each of them. I wish I could devote an hour to each, but we have just 1 hour for all three. Okay, next question is, how do you view games where these archetypes have been integrated into the game as psychological drivers explicitly? For instance, the World of Darkness games like Vampire, Werewolf, and Changeling. Oh man, I have thoughts about this. Vampire in particular, I've been known to pick on before. So this is not a surprise to anybody. I view these games as on an individual basis, is what I will say. And that is because I believe that in terms of like archetypes and psychology and like negativity and positivity and all that stuff, like you are what you eat. And in Vampire, the meat and the sauce of the game is, Machiavellianism, power struggles, duplicity, like who's going to overthrow the prince. Like I'm mostly thinking about the vampire LARPs. So maybe that's not as fair to tabletop. What I find is it actually makes vampire communities really unstable because all of that stuff bleeds into real life through the process of bleed, which is an actual academic term coined by Emily Care Boss, if you want to know more about that, for folks who haven't heard about that before. And it kind of creates a mess. It's messy. World of Darkness is messy. Not saying like great things can't come out of it and catharsis and shadow work can't come out of it. Absolutely can. But I'm thinking about like the real life community around vampire games. They usually don't have very good outcomes in my experience. And again, that's just, I'm talking about me and what I have personally observed. I'm sure other folks have had wonderful times with no problems. But it seems to me like because of the nature of the psychic content of Vampire, it's a little fraught. There are other games. I often point to Legend of the Five Rings as like a counter example to World of Darkness, and that is because its psychic material is like loosely based off of Bushido and honor and doing the right thing and like codes of like family and social hierarchy. And so when you reify that over and over again in your imaginal space, you are working with a different diet. You're metabolizing different things. And I think each individual RPG is like that. Like it's its own meal, its own food group. And you probably just don't want to eat the same food over and over and over again. You probably want some variety. So I hope that answered that question. Shine. So the next question is about shine. How much of this is for someone playing a character and how much for those watching the character doing things? I think it's an even split. Like if you're playing a character without shine, personally, like that's a bummer. So there's like nothing good about engaging with your own character, and there's nothing like that makes him special and exciting and like make you proud to be that character. It's going to be hard to hang on to. Like there certainly is like misery tourism LARPing. It exists, right? But how much are you going to really grab onto and be able to process if you're just like unhappy the entire time? Hard to say. And then of course, shine is important from the opposite direction. Again, when you're trying to sell an ensemble, usually NPCs, to a player so that they invest in them. So I think in both realms, actually, it's important to have shine. Like, and you should be specific about like what's joyous about this character, even the villains. Okay. Next question is, I think I have often designed LARP characters and their relationships for transformation. Without really unveiling this for the players, what are your thoughts on this? So my personal thoughts on this is transformation is a powerful process. And I think personally that people should be like made aware that that's a component of what they're digging into. And again, especially younger people, right, who may not be armed to understand these things yet, or not in a place to really grapple with these things, but also like people who have been through a lot and maybe don't want to open that box right now. Like, it's informed consent. It's the way you would inform consent for anything else, like sexual role play, or like, you know, dark subjects or anything else. Like, let people choose and opt into experiences, and everybody will have a better time, I think. Okay. Oh, you guys are asking a lot of questions. This is great. I'm going to try to get through them all. How effective is the process when designing for players whose cultural narratives and life experiences may be very different? Or in practice, does the universal collective unconscious guarantee a level of success? Ooh, that is a dicey question. And that is because the collective unconscious is a controversial thing. You know, Carl Jung was Western. He was white European. And, you know, we have to take into consideration, and that's what this theory base was derived from, was Western culture. So I personally think archetypes are universal. Like, the mother exists in the West, the mother exists in India, the mother exists in Thailand, it exists in Mexico, it exists, you know, with Inuit folks. The real question is, like, how is the mother interpreted locally, right? Like, there's this base archetype of the mother, right? It's a wide archetype. You've heard me say that before. But inside of what that archetype contains varies by culture. So you cannot take like the Western ideal of the mother in like, you know, modern America and be like, yeah, it's really going to be the same in India. It is not going to be the same in India. And that's where you really have to be careful. One thing that I kind of didn't differentiate for this talk, and maybe I should have, is there's a difference between an archetype and an archetypal image. These are two phrases, archetype and archetypal image, that are used in Jungian psychology. And often when we talk about archetypes, we're actually talking about archetypal images, meaning a specific interpretation of a base archetype, relevant to our local culture, right? And we just don't think about it because we're just thinking locally, and we're like, well, what does global even mean? India's archetypal image is really different, right, from America's archetypal image of the mother. The mother's base archetype, which we all share, there's absolutely differentiation within that archetype based on where you are, who you are, your socioeconomic values, you know, what you've been through, all of that stuff. And so your base question here is, if I work with archetypes, will I be successful? I think so. You just kind of want to be aware of the fact that they can mean different things to different people from different cultures. But I think everyone understands, you know, who the mother is, no matter what culture they're from. Okay. So the next question is, you've talked about creating ensemble characters. Can you seed player characters for Catharsis? I guess Bluebeard's Bride probably does this so more generally. Yes. Yes, you can. You can seed player characters for Catharsis really directly, again, like I said, with Bluebeard's Bride, which is like the whole point of the game. Or you can do it more subtly, or as like an ancillary process for your characters when you're designing a game. If you know, think about like, where can that archetype go? Am I building space for that archetype to move through processing through my mechanics? Then yes, absolutely. You know, I try to do this with most of my games, like even Hollow Vista, which is a mobile game that came out this last year. The ensemble cast it was purposely designed to be a cathartic ensemble with different parts of the self represented in each character. It's just like a common practice that I use now in all of my work, and it is pretty resonant, so it seems to work out, and I'll probably keep doing it. Oh, someone wants to take time to ask a question verbally. Is that okay, Sarah?
It's up to you.
Yeah, I'm down with it.
All right, thanks. It's just easier. So you said a lot about making this ensemble among the NPCs, and I'm a bit wondering why not place it closer to the players, to let them guide the process of expressing these archetypes. And I take that from my experience of games like one that one of my partners did about playing the coping mechanisms in your brain. So everyone is a coping mechanism. So very like boiling it down to these things, but also playing games like Monster Hearts, where like you're playing teenagers and they all have a very stereotypical problem. So they're pretty much you get your complex, and that's your character, and then you go from there. Or at least partially, that's what I feel it's like. Like, why do you feel like you prefer placing it among the NPCs rather than dumping the players in the shoes of the archetypes and letting them guide the process, so they can also pull the brakes and push forward themselves on these developments?
Got you. I totally understand the question. And actually, I do both. Like Bluebeard's Bride is a treatise on that in specific, where players are kind of like forced into playing cathartic archetypes. The reason why ensembles are a great tool is because, not everyone actually can get that close with their complexes sometimes. Like people are not in the right phase of their lives, or can't deal with it, or it makes them extremely uncomfortable and too vulnerable. So especially in video games where you don't like have a choice about like what the player is doing, right? You have to guarantee their agency to some degree, and everything's a little more flat. Ensembles are a great way to surround the player with what they do need for that catharsis. So I absolutely agree. Like sometimes it's more effective and powerful to be more direct, like in your face, like you're just playing your complex today, have fun. But again, I want to equip people who are not able to deal with that too, in the sort of like secondary, like slightly more removed, right? Slightly more alibi, as we talked about, way to engage with the same material. So it's like apples and oranges, and sometimes you need an apple and sometimes you need an orange. But you should probably have both available for folks.
Then I understand completely. I mostly do tabletop, and then it's easier to contain the situation
if
it goes
sure.
awry. And it's definitely a high trust situation. So in terms of safety, I agree with you completely. Yeah.
Awesome. Thank you for your question. Okay, next question. What do you think would be the obstacles and benefits of approaching a game table session 0 with these archetypes as points of discussion with players, where everyone involved contributes to creating these archetypes ahead of time in order to set up some want to see explore results? I think that's a fantastic idea. I think if you can get players far enough into this world of ideals that we've been talking about, where they understand this and they want to actively participate, and they're like, yeah, today I want to pick at this one complex that I have, or I want to uncover this unconscious thing in my shadow. Like, great, that's wonderful. You have highly emotionally intelligent players, and you should take advantage of that. That sounds like a really cool deal to me, and I would love to be at that table too. So you should do so. Like, you should actually do that. You should have those discussions. You should directly talk about those archetypes. My only caution is something I mentioned earlier, which is like, don't set this up for like success failure. Like you did catharsis or you didn't, because then some players will be like, why didn't we specifically engineered this game so I could feel these things or do these things or arrive at these places, and I didn't do that. Now I feel bad. That's the only contingency you kind of want to plan for and make space for, and like normalize is like, we may not get there. This is just the journey. We'll set everything up, but the bowling ball will roll and we'll see what pins it hits. Because otherwise it feels too much like a controlled execution of like almost a medicine, capital M, and that's not what role-playing games are. They're too flexible and unpredictable for that, right? This isn't an actual treatment of anything. So just kind of like keep that perspective in mind. Okay, just checking on time. We have about 8 minutes left. So I mentioned 5 aspects of what influences the self. Are these applicable? Should they be applied to archetypes also? Based upon what you said about archetypes and instantiations of them in various cultures. So I believe what we're talking about, I'll go back to that page, is this one. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Yeah, that's 5. So where is the self derived from? And then the question is like, should that also be applied to archetypes? And I think my answer is kind of, but mostly no. So we do absolutely want to take into account the instantiations of archetypes in various cultures, as we previously talked about in the last culture. But archetypes generally sit below like the socially derived self to some degree, and the ecologically derived self to some degree, and like our mind map of like consciousness to unconsciousness, right? They're in the unconscious area. So I wouldn't try to apply like the 5 derivations of self like on an archetypal ensemble character as archetype, like them as a character. Yeah, you should take these things into account to make them feel like a real person, but I wouldn't mess with the base archetype in that way. Hope that makes sense. Yeah. Okay, this one. Okay, I have seen gaming ensembles work well as harm reduction transition for women and men coming out of the sex industry, where they were forced to create a new persona through a stage name. It's been helpful in their abilities to practice more agency over the self that they create, and then are able to gain more proximity to their complexes with safety. This is so good. Thank you for validating this discovery that I have seen and been playing with for a bit. Oh, not a question. Awesome. Yes, that sounds really cool and really powerful. And I'm glad that folks can find a measure of stability and integration through that. Okay. Next question is, when we are deeply immersed in a character, where is the self, capital S? This is a great question. So I think the self, capital S, supersedes a character we may be immersed in. The self, capital S, is kind of like a meta structure. It's not like this is an individual. The self, again, is a tapestry of all the pieces of us, including the persona. So when we're deeply immersed in a character, what's actually happening is that character has come forward to occupy fully their persona, this part. And that's where that character is sitting, is right in the middle of the persona, taking up all that space. But the persona itself, again, is still only a component part of the big S self, which still consists of our conscious self, our unconscious self, the collective unconscious, and all of our archetypes and complexes. Like that's still all running in the background as we take this immersive character and totally delve ourselves into them and bring them forward to the persona. Okay, I think I've reached the end of our questions for now. And anything else that anybody wants to slip in?
Doris was sharing that Bluebeard's Bride was a super cathartic experience for her and very transformative experience. Are you willing to tell us a little bit about that?
Ooh. Me or Doris?
You don't have to. You don't have to.
I'd love to hear from Doris.
Well, I was playing with a bunch of friends, all very smart people, and we all picked characters that would challenge us, or one of the sister aspects that would challenge us. And I played the witch, and it was really the first time that I felt like I fully allowed myself to step in my power and be accepted as that I didn't have to please, that I didn't have to be nice, that I could just play and be the witch. And it was really great to be seen as one of the grown-ups in the room through that role, and how empowering that was. And it just let me cut through a lot of bullshit that I tend to put up with in my daily life. So thank you very, very much for designing this wonderful game, Strix. It was really tremendous for me.
That's so awesome. And thank you for sharing your experience. I will just mention for everybody in the audience, I co-designed Bluebeard's Bride, Marissa Kelly and Sarah Richardson, so they get credit too.
Yes, they get credit too.
Since I just checked it out and I talked about Monster Hearts before, can I just ask, like, they're both powered by the apocalypse. Do you think that these very archetypical games that the Powered by the Apocalypse rule set is designed for help or hinder these types of play?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I mean, we used Powered by the Apocalypse because it was accessible. That's actually what we cared about when we were designing Bluebeard's Bride, is we didn't want overcomplicated rules to get in the way of the experiential aspect, because Bluebeard's Bride is very much an experiential game, and not all role-playing games are like that. We heavily modified the Apocalypse engine, like a lot. Like we have diceless moves, we have diceless mechanics in our game that certainly are not reflected in Apocalypse World itself. So yeah, when we were deciding to use Powered by the Apocalypse, it was mainly for the accessibility reasons, not so much for archetypal thinking, except for the playbooks aspect was really convergent with what we wanted to do with our sisters, which are the player characters that you get to play in Bluebeard's Bride. And that, like, it's a very specific playbook, like, here's who you are, here's what you've going on, go define some relationships around this. And then we did use the moves to be expressive of archetypal values in the move list for each character too. So.
All right, well, thank you so much for this amazing talk and for, helping us launch this initiative's event series. We really appreciate you being here and sharing all your wisdom with us.
Yes, thank you so much for having me. I really get to talk for like a full hour about this stuff. Usually I get like the 45 minutes plus like some crammed in questions. This is a great format. Thank you to the university for caring about transformative play. That's really important to me in my work. And I think just talking about this more as a community will only help us lead richer lives. So thank you very much for putting this together.
All right, well, I hope that all of you will stay tuned. You can see more about Strix's work on strixworks.com if you want to put that in the chat. And then you can like us on the Transformative Play Initiative website on Facebook. And also we have a mailing list if you would like to join to get updates about events. There's also the Games and Society Lab that we are part of, and that also has a Facebook page. So if you want to learn more about sort of the larger initiatives that are happening at Uppsala in games design, then go ahead and like the Games and Society Lab as well. Is there anything else that you'd like to say, Doris, about what we're brewing here?
I'm so thrilled that we had you as the first talk for this series, Strix, and it's been a real privilege. Thank you so much.
All right. Thank you, folks. Have a wonderful day.
Bye.
Bye.